Hi guys, Jamie here from JB Motion. I was throwing a few stones into a lake the other day and I noticed the ripples and I thought that it would be a good idea to bring it into Cinema 4D and put some spheres into the scene and make it look like the spheres were actually causing the ripples. So we're going to learn how we can go about doing that now. First of all, we're going to be starting off in After Effects. We're going to be tracking the camera, bringing it into Cinema 4D, and then we're going to set up our scene. So let's get started on this. Here we go. So we're going to be starting off in After Effects. First thing we're going to do is import in our video. So just go to File, Import, and click on File. Now this is my video file. I recorded it using my phone, and if I open up the properties here, you can see that it was recorded at 1280 by 720. So this is going to be something that you can share on Instagram. It's not going to give you any HD output at the end of this, so just keep that in mind. And the frame rate was recorded at 29.85 frames a second, so we're going to round that off to 30 frames a second just to make everything easier for ourselves. So let's import that in, and first thing we want to do after we've imported it is go to File and Interpret Footage. Click on Main, and let's set the frames per second here to 30. Hit enter. And now we can drag this video file down into create a new composition. Just hover over this icon and then release. That'll create a new composition for us. So we want to find the point in which we want to start our video. So we don't want to see any of the rocks that were thrown in the water. So you can see that there's a rock being thrown in there. We don't want to see that, so we're going to start the video around this point here. So it's frame 229. So I'm going to hit B on my keyboard to set the in point there, and then we're just going to get the rest of the video right to the end, because you can't actually see any more stones there. This one, I had thrown the stone before the camera panned over, and the same with this one. The stone was already thrown and then I panned the camera over. So what we want to do now is hit Control Shift and X to trim our composition to the work area. What we can do instead of that shortcut is just go to Composition, and you'll find that option here. Okay, so now if we just turn off our sound and play that back, this is what we're getting. I might actually just cut out this part here so we don't get those splashes there as well. So I'll hit B on my keyboard and then Control Shift X again. So we're starting from this point here, frame 264. So that's looking pretty good. Now we want to track our camera. So let's go to Animation and Track Camera. So that's going to analyze there, and it's going to, you can see it's initializing up here. Once that's done, I'm going to pause the video. Once that's finished, I'll pop back in. Okay, so it's at the solving camera stage, so it shouldn't take too much longer. There we go. So now you can see we have all our track points. We have to scrub through there, and if we hover over them, we're going to get our target. Now you can see we're getting a message that says no depth from a tripod pan solve. So After Effects, basically the AI in After Effects has decided that the camera was a tripod pan, so I wasn't moving in and out of the scene. I was just kind of holding my camera and just panning around. So that's not going to be a problem at all. We can reduce the track point size down to about 41%, and the target size we can reduce down to about the same. Okay, so now we need to create some track solids and a track camera. So to do that, we need to pick where we want to create our track solids. So I'm going to have I'm going to create two track solids because I want a track solid to be in the shot at all times. So we can have one, let's say here. It doesn't really matter. You can put yours anywhere as long as it's going to be, as long as there's always going to be a track solid in the shot. So I'm going to create mine here. So I'm going to create, what you need to do first is use your left click button. That'll give you these 3 yellow circles, and then right click and click on create solid and camera. Now that's going to create a track solid and a 3D tracker camera. So that stays in our shot all the way up to this point at which it leaves. And now I want to create another track solid, just so we're going to have a track solid in the shot at all times. Most of the time anyway. So I'm going to set one up here. Kind of picking this at random now. Use my left click to get my 3 yellow circles, then right click, and this time we're just going to create a solid. We already have our tracker camera in there. So now if we scrub back and just hit play, you can see that our track solids are in position, and that our tracker camera is moving around them. And we always have a track solid in the shot at all times. Okay, so that's that. The next thing we want to do is just save our file. So go to File, Save As, and I am going to put this into this folder and call it main. And now we need to export this as a file we're going to be able to open up in Cinema 4D. So go to File, Export. Before we do that, just go into Composition and Composition Settings. Just make sure that the frame rate is set to 30. We did that at the start. So if you didn't do that at the start, you will have to go back to the beginning and do everything again. So that's fine. We already did that. And let's go File and Export, Maxon Cinema 4D Exporter. Ignore this, click on OK, and now we can pick a place to save that to. I'm going to go for the same folder, and I'm going to call this track cam and save that out. So now we can jump into Cinema 4D and we can open up the trackcam Cinema 4D file that we just exported out of Cinema 4D. So if we hit play on this, this is the setup we have just exported out of After Effects. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is, you can see that our time has actually started here at 264, and the reason for that is because we cut our video and it's starting here on frame 264. But what I want to do is I want to set this to frame 0, and I'm going to import my video. Let's call this background. And we can import this into the luminance channel. And let's create a background object, and let's add this material. Let's apply this material onto our background object. Now if we hit play, nothing's going to happen. We need to go into our background material go to the editor option here and click on animate preview. So now we're going to get some playback in our viewport. But you can see it's wrong. So the camera's moving over here, but the Cinema 4D camera is not matching up with it. And the reason for that is because we need to start our video on frame 264. So if we jump back into Cinema 4D, let's open up the background material, go to our luminance channel where our video is, and then click on this thumbnail. Now go into the animation tab, and we need to tell this to start at 264. Start frame 264. And we also need to make sure that the frame rate is set to 30. And we already did this in After Effects, but we are now importing the raw video file again. So we need to make sure to change that again to match up with our tracked camera. Okay, so now if we go back to the beginning and hit play, you can see that everything's matching up nicely. Okay, so now we can start setting up our spheres. So the first one we can do is the one that's going to be here. It's going to be causing these ripples. So let's just create a sphere. And what we can do is we can drag it down to make it a child of this track solid 1, the green one. And then if you hit Shift C on your keyboard, type in PSR, and let's just drag this tool up to our tool panel here, just in case we need to use it again. Hit Escape on your keyboard. And now if we click on the Reset PSR, that's going to reset this sphere's position relative to the track solid, relative to its parent. And it's also going to share the same material with it. We don't want it to do that, so we can drag it back out. And now our sphere is in the same position as our track solid. So if I deactivate this camera, you'll see that it's right there. Okay, so we need to position our sphere in the right place so that it's going to give the illusion that this sphere is what's creating these ripples. And already that looks pretty good. So you're going to have to eyeball it yourself. So that's already a good position. But what we can do to help out with this, what we need to do to help out with this is create a floor. I call it a floor, but it's actually going to be the object that represents our lake. So to do that, we're going to create a plane, and we are going to call it floor. Well, let's just call it lake, because that's the real world object that it's going to be representing. And we need to create a new material, and we can call it lake. Let's open that up, and we're going to turn off reflectance, and in the color channel we're going to load in the same video again. We don't actually need to do that. What we can do is we can just go to our background material and go to luminance. We can copy the shader here. Then we can jump back into our lake material, and then we can go into our color channel and just paste that in, so that our frame rate and our movie star frame is going to be the same. Okay, so now let's apply our lake material to our lake object. That's looking pretty good. So we want to set this to be frontal. And well, first of all, we can't actually see our lake object because it's flat. If I move this down, now you're going to be able to see it. We need to position this in a way that it is on the same position and rotation as our lake. So what we can do is make it a child of our track solid 1 and then reset the position, scale, rotation. Now it's adjusted the rotation so that it is going to be correct relative to our camera and our track solid. So it's going to look like the actual lake. Let's bring it up to the top of our object manager, and now we can just move it down. So we've already set, click on your texture tag here, we've already set the projection type to frontal. Before we had it as UVW. So we need to set it to frontal, and we need to make it bigger so that it's going to take up most of our lake. So what we can do is go into our coordinates tab of our lake object, and let's set the, actually your object tab, let's set the width here to 10,000 and the same on the height. So we can move this, let's see, let's deactivate our camera and get this kind of into position. So we can move this edge here pretty close to our camera, because obviously we're not going to be seeing behind there. The reason we're making this so big is so that when we render this out, this line is going to be as far away as we can have it, I suppose, without this being too big. Okay, so that's good enough for now. We can always move it around later if needs be. And if I hit play here now, you can see that it's not actually animated. The video isn't playing back on our lake object. So same again, we just need to open up our lake material, and in the editor tab here, just click on animate preview, and that should play back now perfectly. What we also need to do is click on our lake, right click on our lake object, go to Cinema 4D tags and add a compositing tag, and go to the tag tab and turn on compositing background. And I'll tell you why we're doing that in just a minute. Well, I'll tell you right now, because if we have that turned off and we render, you can see that that's not blended in very well at all. And if we turn it on, we're getting a nice blend between our lake object and our background. Okay, so now we're going to be able to position our sphere once we're happy enough with the position of our lake. So we want to move it down to about -252 on the y-axis. And let's deactivate our camera again just to check where we're at. Okay, that's fine. So now we can bring our sphere down to meet our lake. So now you can see that our sphere is in our lake. So what we want to do now is make sure that it looks like it is creating the ripples. So we need to bring the position of our sphere to the origin of the ripples as best we can, and you're going to have to eyeball it. So somewhere like there. Just going to reduce the size of my viewport here so that I can't see any edges. Yeah, so that's looking pretty good. So we can make this bigger and set the radius of this sphere to be 165. And we can now create a light. We're going to create an infinite light. And let's make it a child of our track solid so that we'll be able to reset the PSR. And now it's going to share the same position and rotation as our track solid. So we're going to be able to rotate it and have it pointing straight down relative to our camera. So if I click on our light now and go to rotate, I want to rotate this around the x-axis. So hold down shift after you start rotating it and rotate it to a value of minus 90 degrees. So that's pointing directly down relative to our 3D tracker camera. Okay, so let's see if we can turn on some shadows now. In your shadow tab, set the shadow to area and reduce the density to 65%. Let's render that out now and see. So we're getting some shadows on our lake. Now we don't want the shadows to be directly under our sphere because we want to kind of try and match up the direction of our light to the to match up with the sun in the real world scene. So you can see that the shadows kind of going in this direction a bit, so we want to replicate that with our light object. So let's just rotate it around the Y here, the green circle here, to rotate it so that our light source is going to be pointing in this direction. You can see the white line showing the direction the light source is going to be pointed in. So now our shadow is going to be slightly offset as opposed to directly underneath our object. Okay, so that's pretty good so far. So let's select our sphere now and let's just bring it back down to our lake. And again, we can move it around if we need to center it up with the origin of our ripples. So I'm happy enough with that. I actually want to increase the scale of that even more. So I'm changing the radius to a value of 220. Just going to play that back now. And I want to push it down further into my lake. Okay. So far so good. So now we'll just let the camera pan over to our next ripples. So we can grab this sphere, hover over any of the axis handles here, hold down Control, and let's just duplicate that. And we want to bring this sphere again to the origin of our ripples, where our ripples start. Again, you're going to have to eyeball it as best you can. So that's looking fairly centered relative to our ripples. Might move it slightly over a bit. Yeah, about there maybe. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And for our last sphere, we're going to do the same. Just duplicate this. You can hover over the axis handle and just hold down Control. Click and drag. And I'm going to make this sphere a bit smaller. So I'm going to scale this down. Radius, this is set to 95 centimeters. So now we can just organize our spheres in our object manager. And that's good to go. Okay, so we have all our spheres in position. Now we're gonna set up the animation. So first of all, our spheres are looking a bit too still. They should be kind of bobbing around the place, as they would if they were on the lake. And not only that, they're going to be flying up in the air, so they're also going to be bobbing around the place. It's going to make it look a bit more realistic. So to do that, we're going to use vibrate tags. So click on this first sphere here, and right click and go to C4D tags, vibrate. Let's enable position and set the amplitude to 100, 100 on the X, the Y, and the Z. Set the frequency to 0.3, and let's see what that looks like. So that's going to be bobbing around the place, and it looks a lot more realistic. And it's actually compensating for the shaky hand of mine while I recorded this video. So what we can do is we can duplicate this vibrate tag, hold down Control, and let's just add it to our sphere 1, and do the same for sphere 2. And we can change the seed of this one to be 1 and the seed of this one to be 2. And the reason we're doing that is so that we're not getting the exact same movement at the exact same time on all of our spheres. So they're all going to be vibrating with different seeds. Okay, so now we can set up the animation for our spheres to be rising out of the water. And I don't think we need our track solids anymore, so I'm going to turn those, or we will need them again at some stage, but not right now. And it turns out that we didn't actually need this one. But anyway, let's move on. So we're going to animate our spheres so that they slowly or quickly, depending on our ripples, they're going to slowly rise out of the water. You can see our video ends here, right there. So we can just set our frame range here to end at 722. Okay. So at about frame 28, I'm going to select this sphere and I'm going to add a keyframe. And I'm going to play forward a little bit to about frame 74, maybe even forward a bit more actually, to about frame 130, and I'm going to move this sphere up along the Y to about here. Not being exact with coordinates here now, you can if you want. Minus 110 on the Y. I'm just eyeballing it to where I feel like it looks good. So frame 130, move it up along the Y so that it's away from the lake, and then add another keyframe. Now make sure that you are adding keyframes using this button for this, so that all of these properties, rotation, scale, and move, all these are going to have a keyframe. If you add a keyframe just using the Y, it's going to mess up the vibrate tags. So make sure you're doing it like this. So now let's see what that looks like. That slowly rises up out of the water, and the vibrate tag gives it the impression that it's kind of floating around in the air. Now we're going to do the same with this sphere. We're going to scrub back to a point that we want the animation to kick in. So I'm going to go to about frame 257. I'm going to add a keyframe, play it forward there, and at this stage I want it to be up out of the water, so I'm going to bring it up along the Y 2 about there. And again, I'm just saying 2 about here, 2 about there. This is the value. I'm not even looking at it. I'm just looking at the viewport and seeing what looks good. And I'm adding a keyframe using the red button here, not adding a keyframe in the properties there. Don't want to mess up those vibrate tags. So now we got our 2 spheres risen up out of the water. This one pops up at a good time so that it looks like it's the cause of the ripples. And then the last one here. So for the last one, I just want to turn on my interactive render region and make sure that I'm happy with its position. So let's just bring it up along the Y to see where our shadow's at. Bring it down. So I want to center it a bit more relative to the origin of the ripples. Okay, so I'm happy enough with the position of that sphere now. Happy enough almost. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. I just want to make it look as realistic as possible. So I'm going to bring this sphere so that it's actually submerged for the first keyframe. Turn off my interactive render region, and let's find the point at which we want this animation to kick in. So make sure that the sphere is close enough to the surface without actually showing it. So about here, maybe go back a little bit. About here, I'm going to add a keyframe. And then I'm going to go to about here, and our sphere is going to jump out. And I'm going to add another keyframe. So let's see what that looks like. So that needs to happen a bit sooner, I think. And also I'm not liking the positioning now of my sphere. So I'm going to undo both of those keyframes. So I'm just going to, you can see the keyframes here in the timeline. Hit Control Z a few times until both of those disappear. And I want to reposition my sphere now, because I'm not liking the actual position of it. This sphere is pretty important because it's the only one that you can actually see coming out of the water in full. The other ones are kind of hidden away, so we have to take a bit more care with this one. Okay, so that looks good enough. If we bring it out of the water, how does it look? It looks good there. Okay. So as I'm scrubbing, the vibrate tag's actually moving around also. So I have to kind of wrestle with that at the same time. So I'm going to go for about here. Now again, I know this isn't really helpful for you guys because I'm saying about here. So again, you're going to have to make sure that you're eyeballing it and making it look good yourselves. I'm going to add a keyframe. And then I'm going to bring it forward, and it's going to be jumping out. So there's a small gap between the start keyframe and the last keyframe there. So it jumps out to about here. And set a keyframe there. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that's looking way better. So you just have to kind of take a bit more effort with this last sphere to get it looking really good. Because as I said, this one's kind of hidden. You can't really see it breaking the surface. So you can kind of get away with, you know, any old position on that one. And the same with this one. It's actually out of shot by the time you actually see it leave the water. So this one you actually have to take a lot of care with. because you can see it break the surface. So I might actually have that animation start a bit earlier. So what you can do is, to highlight both of these keyframes, is to just click outside of them and just click and drag. That'll select both of them, and then you can click in any of this gray area to bring both of them forward a bit. So now let's check that. Yeah, that looks a bit better. Okay, so I'm happy enough with the animation. Next is we're going to try and make our overall scene look a bit more realistic. So let's just do a render preview on this to see what it's looking like so far. Just checking some frames here at random. Okay, so what we can do is add some reflection to our lake material so that our spheres are going to be reflected by it. So let's open that up, and we can turn on our reflectance channel, and let's add a Beckman. Bring down the reflection strength to about 23 or 24%, and the roughness set to 6. Let's go into our color channel and set that to white. Oh, and go back into reflectance and make sure the attenuation is set to additive. Actually, undo that last step and undo the color setting to white also. We just want to, so I'm going to do that again actually, because I don't want to be confusing you guys. So open up your lake material, reflectance, add a Beckman, and bring the reflection strength down to 24% and set the roughness to 6%. Okay. So let's see what that gives us. So now you can see we're getting some reflection here in our lake. It's reflecting our sphere just a little bit, but it's nice and subtle. We don't want it too much. And the same here. That's pretty good. Okay. Now, next we are going to create the material for our spheres. So let's double click to create a new material. We'll call this spheres, and let's just add this onto each of our spheres. And this is pretty easy to set up. We're just going to go into our color channel, make it white, and go into our reflectance channel. Let's add a Beckman, and we can set the attenuation here to additive. Let's do a quick render preview to see what that looks like. It's looking pretty cool. You can see that we're not getting any reflection of our clouds above. So to do that, we can create a plane up in our sky, and then we can add the clouds image that you guys can download, or probably have already downloaded from the description below. Before we do that, I just want to turn the reflection strength down just a little bit, or a lot actually. I'm going to go down to about 30%. Yeah, something like that. And now let's create our clouds. But before we do that, hit NB on your keyboard to show our lines. And I want to create a bit of displacement in our lake object. just as the sphere is rising up out of it, just as it breaks the surface of our lake, right about there. Just for a bit more realism, you'll be able to see that our lake will kind of cover over the edges a bit. So what we're going to do that is create a displacer deformer. You can hold down, just create one actually, add it to the object manager, and then make it a child of the lake. Let's deactivate our camera for now. And let's turn off our grid. Now we need to increase the segments of our plane, of our lake object. So click on it, go into the object tab, and let's increase the width and the height segments to 1000 each. So that's quite dense, as you can see. That'll give us more detail in our displacement. Okay, so let's go into our displacer object, go into the object tab, go into the shading tab, actually, and click on this triangle here beside shader. Let's add a noise shader on there. Let's open that up, and we want to increase the global scale to 750%. So you can see that's looking more like water. But we only want the displacement to happen around the area that our sphere is, and only when our sphere is touching the lake. So what we can do there is go into our fall off tab in our displacer object, and we can create a spherical field. And we want to position the spherical field in the exact same position as this sphere here. So let's make it a child of sphere 2. That's this one here. And then we can reset the PSR. So now that's going to bring the spherical field to the same position as our sphere. Okay, so we don't need that to be a child of our sphere 2 anymore, so we can bring it back to be a child of our displacer, and we can increase the scale of it, and we can go into our displacer object, go into the object tab, and let's increase the height. So you can see that that's having an effect there. We don't want to go too high. Maybe about 55 centimeters on that, and we can also animate this. Now, as you can see, our spherical field remains in the same position, so we need to have it as a child of our sphere so that it will follow it. And then when our sphere leaves the water, the displacement will no longer be there. And again, as I was saying, we want to turn on animation in our displacer, in our noise shader. So go into displacer object, go to the shading tab, open up that noise, and let's add an animation of about 1.5. Let's see what that looks like. Maybe even 2. Yeah, so 2 looks a bit better. Okay, so I'm happy enough with that. Let's see if we need to do the same for any of our other spheres. So we'll go right back to the beginning. So we need to do it for this sphere as well, because it's looking super flat around the edges there where it's breaking the surface of the water. This one we don't need it because you can't actually see where it is breaking the surface of the water there. So we just need one more for sphere 1. So to do that, we can just duplicate this spherical field, hold down Control, and drag it under sphere 1, which is this one. And then we need to add this spherical field into our displacer fall off tab. So click on your displacer object, go into the fall off tab, and then just drag this spherical field down into it. Now we need to make sure that this spherical field is in the same position as its parent. So we can click on it and reset the PSR. And we need to increase the scale of this also. So let's just scale that up. Deactivate your camera. And let's see, we need to increase the scale a bit more maybe to play on that. Okay, so we're not getting any displacement here, and the reason for that is because we need to change the blending mode to add. Right now this spherical field is overwriting, so this is the one. Let's rename these so we don't get confused. We'll call this spherical field 0.1, and this one can be spherical field 0.2. So if we go into our displacer object, we can see that spherical field 0.1 is the one we just added. Let's bring it to the top. Doesn't actually matter, but let's bring it to the top. Now you can see that it's having an effect on our water, but we need to set this to add so that it doesn't overwrite the existing spherical field. So now we should be getting displacement not only there, but also here when this sphere decides to show itself. Okay, and so we are. So we're getting a bit too much displacement over here because the spherical field for sphere 1 is way too big. So let's scale that down. And that's looking a bit better. Okay, so let's see what that is looking like. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. Let's scrub forward a bit here. Do a quick render preview. This one pops up, and so does that one. Okay, so that's all looking pretty good. Now we can create a sky object. So we're going to need a HDRI image. Well, I'm not going to be able to provide a HDRI image because I didn't create one. But what we can do as a workaround is jump back into our After Effects scene. Let's turn off our track solids, and let's find a nice spot here. We can turn off this 3D camera tracker as well so that we're not seeing those track points. And we can save this frame as an image, and then we can attach it to our sky object as a material. So let's just go to composition, save frame as, file, and change the output module here to a, we'll go for a TIFF, and click OK. And let's output it to here, whatever folder you're working in, and we can call this sky material, and let's render that. Now if we jump back into Cinema 4D, we can create a new material and call it sky, and let's import in that image that we just created into our luminance channel. Okay, now let's create the sky object, and we don't want it to be seen by the camera, so right click, go to Cinema 4D tags, add a compositing tag, and let's turn off seen by camera. Now we can apply this sky material to our sky object, and we also need to turn on global illumination here. So go into your render settings and go to effect and turn on global illumination. Let's see what that looks like. I'm just going to actually turn off save, go into my output here and just do a current frame so that I'll be able to render to picture viewer to see what this is looking like. Okay, so what we're getting right now is, well, we're getting a line here that we don't want anyway, first of all. And also, we don't want our sky objects, we don't want our lake to be reflecting our sky object. So what we need to do is we need to exclude it. So go to your lake object, actually go to your sky object, go into the compositing tag and go into exclusion. Now if we drag down the lake here into excluded objects and do another render to picture viewer on that, hopefully now, yeah, so that's gotten rid of our line here because our sky is no longer being reflected by our lake. So that is looking way better. And the fact that our global illumination is turned on is actually kind of reducing the need for clouds here, the reflection of them anyway, but we can put them in anyway just to make it look a bit nicer. So let's create a plane and we can call it clouds, and we can create a new material and call it clouds also. And let's turn off reflectance and color. We're going to load the clouds image that you can download from the description below. We're going to load that into our luminance channel. Okay. Now before we apply to our clouds plane, let's just position it. So let's just bring it up here. So here it is. Now we can use our track solid to give it the correct rotation relative to our scene. So make it a child of our track solid, hit reset PSR, and now it's going to match up a lot better. Probably need to increase the scale of it now. Let's unchild it, bring it back up to the top of our object manager, and deactivate your 3D tracker camera. Let's bring it right up and let's increase this scale here by a lot. I'm just going to drag that right up. So this is going to be set to about 34,000 on the width and the same on the height. We don't need any segments, well, just one segment on the width and the height for this. And we can bring it up even further along the Y to about here. Let's deactivate our camera again. Just zoom right out. Now you can see, because this is so big, as we're zooming out, it's actually disappearing. So that happens when you have really big objects in your scene. If you zoom out too far, they'll start to cut away. So don't worry about that. We can bring this forward a bit, just so that our camera is going to see it. And actually, no, we need to have it above our scene, kind of centered, because our spheres are going to be reflecting it. And now we can apply our clouds material onto our clouds object. Now if we jump back into our camera, we can make sure that our clouds object is invisible to our camera by adding another compositing tag here. and go into the tag tab and turn off scene by camera, and also turn off cast shadows because we don't want it to be casting shadows over our lake. So turn that off also. Let's see what this looks like. Do a render to picture viewer. So you can see that it's reflecting in our lake. So we don't want it to do that either. So we need to go to our clouds object, click on the compositing tag, go into exclusion, and let's drag our lake down here so that our clouds won't be reflected by our lake. So let's render that again, see what that looks like. And I think I actually, yeah, I prefer when our clouds are being reflected by our lake, because you can see the light is actually bouncing back up and it's making the spheres look better and more realistic in place. So I might just leave them, I might just leave the clouds, let them be reflected by the lake. The only thing is, let's see. I think we might actually be able to just leave it as is, and that could be that. Let me just get rid of this lake here so that it's no longer excluded. So that now our clouds will be reflected by our lake. Let's just go back to frame 0 and see what this is looking like at random frames. So here it's looking okay. The displacement is a bit high there, but I'm leaving it as is. You can mess around with the displacement there if you're unhappy with it, but it's not going to be very noticeable because, you know, the camera's panning around quite quickly. You can't see how quickly it's panning around because we are playing all frames. But if I turn that off, you can see that that's not going to be in the shot for very long. So let's see what this is looking like over here. I think we already did that. Do you know what? I think I'm going to leave it as is. It's not looking too bad. The clouds are being reflected here, but they're not being reflected over here. But you're still getting the reflection of the real sky. The reason they're not being reflected over here is because the lake object doesn't actually go that far. I could bring it over a bit more, I suppose, but I don't want to be messing around with this too much. I think I'm happy enough with that as it is. You guys, of course, are welcome to mess around with it a little bit more if you want, but we still have to bring this into After Effects, because what I want to do in compositing is when this sphere pops up out of the lake, as it does here, I'm just going to set this back to all frames so that we're going to play each frame. It's going to slow down, but just so I can show you what I mean. So this sphere is going to pop up, and as the camera pans over and kind of center shots this sphere, I want to blur this sphere out. Now, without having to set up a physical render and set up depth of field in Cinema 4D, which is going to increase render time, what we can do is we can add a compositing tag onto this and go into the object buffer tab and just enable that. And then when we're setting this up for render in our render settings, we just need to turn on multipass and add the object buffer. Group ID is set to 1, buffer here is set to 1. So that'll render that out, and we'll be able to blur this and only this sphere in compositing inside of After Effects. Let's do another render to picture viewer here. See what that's looking like. Yeah, I'm liking that frame, and let's go forward a bit. to this one here. Let's see what that looks like here. Okay. So I think I'm happy enough with that. I think I'm going to set this up for render. Okay, yep, setting it up for render. The time has come. So let's just save this first, file save as, and we can save it here as, well, we can just save it as is. It's saying track cam. I don't like overwriting stuff, so I'm just going to give this a new name and save it. And now I'm going to go into my render settings. Make sure that you have created this compositing tag on your sphere and you've set that in the object buffer to 1 and enabled it. Multipass should be turned on and you need to create an object buffer. We've already done that. I have. And there it is there. Group ID is set to 1, same as the buffer here. Anti-alias, and we don't need it. We don't see any jagged edges really in our reflections. Output is 1280 by 720. Frame rate is 30. We're going to render all the frames. And we're going to save it as a PNG sequence. And we're going to save it to the work folder in a new folder called sequence. And I'm going to call this main. And the multipass image, we're going to save this also as a PNG sequence. And into the work folder in sequence, I'm going to create a new folder and call it buffer. And I'm just going to call it buffer. Okay, so that's it. Ready to render. Just double check everything. You can never double check everything enough. Triple check. And I'm going to do a Control S to save. I'm going to go to my render queue. And I'm going to add this to my render queue and I am going to start rendering. So that is the end of the Cinema 4D part of this. After this has rendered, we're going to be jumping into After Effects and we're going to be setting up the blur that I was telling you guys about on this sphere. So when this sphere kind of goes out of center shot and this one kind of gets more close to center shot, I want to then blur this one out so it's kind of like, you know, out of focus, and this one takes center stage, so to speak. Okay, so I'll see you guys in After Effects. This is rendering away. It's going to take a bit of time, so it's looking like it's going to take over an hour on my machine. That's going up as well, so maybe an hour and a half. So I'll see you guys in After Effects. Okay, so once your render is finished, you can hop back into After Effects and we're going to be able to import this sequence and see what it looks like. So if you're seeing this panel here, we're in the effects controls. We can just hop back into our project by clicking on these double arrows and selecting project. Now what we can do is import our sequence. Just go to File, Import, and click on File. And let's find our sequence, which is in the sequence folder. Now click on the first frame and you'll be able to import the whole sequence as long as this PNG sequence is ticked. So click import and there it is. So we can just drag this down to our composition icon here and release. That'll create a composition for us. Now we can watch this. So I'm liking the displacement here. Actually, I was worried that it was that the height was set a bit too high, but it actually looks pretty good. That looks fine. And we'll just scrub ahead to our last one. Yeah, so that one jumps out. It's looking okay, but a bit of advice I would give you is to make it look a bit better is to make that sphere smaller. Before you guys hit render on your Cinema 4D scene, just make this sphere a little bit smaller because it's not looking perfect. The ripples are a bit too small for this sphere. So make that smaller, you get a much better effect. Okay, so what we want to do now is import our buffer. And now we're going to, with that, we're going to be able to blur this sphere out of focus as this sphere comes into the center of the shot. So let's import our buffer now. We can just double click in this pane here and go to our buffer folder, click on the first frame, make sure our PNG sequence is ticked, and click on import. Now let's drag this down into our composition, making sure that it's on the top of our main sequence. So we want to use this as a mask to basically only see this sphere. So to do that, we select our main sequence, go to our track matte options and select luminance. Now we're only going to be able to see this sphere, and we're going to be able to add a Gaussian blur onto this and blur it out. So go to your effects and presets here and search for Gaussian. Once you find it, you can just drag Gaussian blur down onto this main sequence here. Now we're going to be able to affect the blur just for this sphere. So let's leave it at 0 for now. We need to duplicate this main sequence, Control D in your keyboard. Bring this new main sequence down to the bottom and set the track matte to no track matte. And also we want to delete the Gaussian blur effect from it. So just select it and hit delete in your keyboard. Okay, so we want to start blurring this out just as this sphere comes into the center of the shot. We want to start adding some blur onto this. So let's see where we're going to add our blur. So we can actually start adding a bit of blur here because it's kind of close to our camera. It'll look a bit realistic if this had a bit of blur onto it. So let's create a keyframe here. Make sure that your main.png sequence is selected, the middle one, not the bottom one, and let's add a keyframe. And we can add a tiny bit of blur here. We'll go 1.3. And let's just show our keyframes. Select your layer there and hit U on your keyboard. So that's going to blur out ever so slightly. And as this is coming into the center of the shot, we're going to blur it out a lot more. So let's add another keyframe here. And let's play it forward a bit. And just as this is coming right to our center shot, we can add a lot more blur onto this sphere here. So let's bring that right up. Not too much. Maybe we'll go to about a value of 7.3. That will automatically add a keyframe in there. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And again, before you guys hit render on your sequence in Cinema 4D, make this sphere a bit smaller, it'll look a bit better. And that is it, guys. So hope you learned a lot. If you did, hit that like button. If you're not subscribed, please do subscribe. and I'll see you in the next video.